Welcome to Practical Shamanism. I'm Katie Weatherup. I'm a former engineer with 20 years of experience working as a shamanic practitioner, and I hope to help you to connect to your personal power and magic and to support you in living a really good life that just keeps getting better. Thank you so much for joining me. One of the things I really enjoy is this woman, Jenny Young. She's a PhD from the Midwest who specializes in rhetorical analysis, and she's applying it to online dating so that we can see what people are revealing that they don't realize they're revealing that could be really problematic or difficult or just makes them a bad candidate for a successful long-term relationship. And she's really funny. She's a satirist and really passionate. And I just really adore her way with words and her ability to distill things. And she shared something that made me think about how we might do this thing to ourselves. So I'm going to share a little bit more about the particular rhetorical pattern in the context of the work that she does. But the idea is that in our society where we maybe take on this notion that we should be all things to all people, we may be punishing ourselves or criticizing ourselves or feeling bad about ourselves for not being more exceptional in areas that would actually be somewhat incongruent with who we are and our greatest strengths. So a lot of times our biggest strength and our shadow really go side by side. I remember reading something in some self-help book somewhere about a therapist who was leading a group of women, and she said, in retrospect, ill-advisedly, we went around and we shared our favorite thing and our least favorite thing about each group member, and they'd been working together for a while, so they knew each other pretty well. And it wasn't a great idea because, there was, I think, a lot of emotional turmoil that got created with these, interesting approach to reflections. But what stood out for her was the answers were like different sides of the same quality. So the thing that people often most love and celebrate you for having could also be the thing that in another context could be a bit challenging. And ideally, we align with people where the price of admission, the thing that annoys us, is something that is totally worth it for the things that are really good and really align. But I just wanted to talk about this a little more in case we are putting unrealistic expectations on ourselves, if we're putting them onto other people. And I just think it's kind of an interesting thing to sort of tease out in terms of the story of who we think we should be. So a lot of this is somewhat gendered. I know that there are men who can, really struggle with who they should be in a gulf between who they are and who they think that is. I would argue that women get a much heftier dose in our society, and there's just a lot more messages, objectively speaking. Now, again, individual results may vary. I've known some women who were very unavailable for any kind of reflections from the world around them. They were just totally justified in who they were experiencing themselves and what they were up to, and men who had a lot of sensitivity and awareness and discernment about how they were affecting other people. And so this isn't to pick on one gender or another, but as a woman looking at this particular person who's sharing some really cool stuff, it sort of came up in a little bit of a gendered context. So Jenny Young runs a wonderful and very vibrant Facebook group called the Burned Haystack Method. And the metaphor is that if you're looking for a needle in a haystack, you don't want to sort through the whole haystack. But if you burn the haystack, the needle is metal, so it won't burn. So then, it's very easy to find. And her premise is with this nifty tool of rhetorical analysis, you can do what's called thin slicing, which is just taking a little bit of data and getting a really good picture. In a lot of cases, it's not a substitute for due diligence or what happens in person, but a lot of people on dating apps reveal them being very unqualified for a healthy relationship, like right up front in the way that they approach their profile. And she does everything from you probably wouldn't enjoy them if They're looking for their mommy, are you my mommy is one rhetorical pattern, to things that are really toxic, like directive disciplinary, or one she calls conditional decency. So if you've been on the apps for a while, you'll see people saying, well, I'll treat you how you treat me, or I'll be nice to you as long as, you respect me, or those kind of things. And these are, ones that correlate with people who can be quite abusive in relationships. Not to say that that's every case, but it's pretty cool because there are a lot of success stories of people who've applied the method and successfully ended up in a relationship that was really working for them. Or even if they didn't find their needle in this metaphor, they found a needle, someone they're like, oh, wow, you're really super cool. And so it just kind of helps cut down on adverse dating experiences and gives women a lot more clarity to support them in sorting through all the craziness that's online. So I'm a huge fan of her work. Again, she's really to the point. She's really succinct. She's really funny. She's really passionate. And I just think that there's a lot of really cool stuff. But the rhetorical pattern that I was interested in for this is she calls it impossible opposites woman. And when she was kind of workshopping the name of it, I think there was, robot girlfriend or AI girlfriend as possible, ways of describing this. But the gist of it is when someone is kind of putting all the qualities a woman could have into a request for one woman to particularly have those qualities in some way. And so she points to the fact that most of us kind of have this internal congruence, and it's a really common thing on dating websites for someone to ask for qualities that probably wouldn't exist in one person because they're not particularly congruent. So the most ubiquitous example of this is all the guys who are saying, I want her to be equally comfortable in jeans and flip-flops as a cocktail dress. She should be able to switch from no makeup and, grubby fishing clothes to a little black dress and a moment's notice. And the example that she highlighted in one particular reel had to do with a guy who was talking about a woman who would do her nails and then go camping. And the point that Jenny was making in her, analysis was, I might do my nails, but I'm probably not going to do them right before I go camping. Like that just doesn't go together. So it's a really interesting thing for someone to specifically call out these things that don't go together and to request them in one person. I really cracked up having had this rhetorical pattern in the back of my mind to come across a very problematic profile. The guy seemed to be trying to win an argument with his ex-girlfriend, and I didn't want to interact with him, but I kind of wanted to write to her and congratulate her on the very excellent choice that she was no longer with him, even despite him being, loosed on the dating world. But one of the things he asked for in this impossible opposites is he had many, many qualities of who you should be if you wanted to date him. Far more to say about who the woman should be than why it would be a nice thing to date him, what he brought to the table. Among his list of demands, he expected her to be charismatic and humble. And I just thought that was really, an interesting juxtaposition of requests, because I'm not saying no one on the planet is both charismatic and humble, but, in the Venn diagram of people who really embody those qualities, there's not necessarily a ton of, overlap or intersection. So we can also turn the lens outward. Obviously, if you're a woman on a dating site, seeing the guy who, is demanding these impossible opposites, like you should be all things that a woman could possibly be all in one package, really great to take a pass on that guy. Or, likewise, if you're a man looking at women's profiles and she has the, rhetorical equivalent of the impossible opposite man, that great thing to take a pass on. But we may want to pay attention to if we're putting that onto other people. So one of the things that's interesting is I think that the warrior archetype can be a really appealing one, or the knight errant archetype. But if you have that archetype, the dude goes off to war a lot. And off on quests, and, he may hold you enshrined in his heart as the thing that, carries him through in dark times. But his communicative availability, emotional intelligence may not be as available or as present in the relationship as something else. I worked with a client years ago, and it was kind of an extreme case where she was just really, really driven by status markers. So she had a lot of status markers in terms of her appearance and how she presented herself on social media. And when it came to dating, she was going for the higher status in some ways, the better. And so this played out with her dating a Navy SEAL. And, there was a lot of satisfaction in like, oh, I won a SEAL, which is an interesting thing. And then being in argument with the reality that his relating skills were really poor. And I was kind of looking at her and going, well, honey, if you think about what the training is for a SEAL and what qualities they need to have and who's really good at this and who's driven to this, the people who communicate super well and have a lot of emotional availability and a lot of sensitivity, they're just a bad match for that particular profession. For the most part, they abound in romance novels, which, of course, perpetuates the stereotype of the have-it-all. So the rom-coms and romance novels and whatnot have a lot of the impossible opposite person in a bunch of different ways. But someone who's just really capable of tuning out their physical discomfort because they're committed to something may not be someone who is going to be really attuned to rapport and subtle responses that you might have. And again, I'm not saying that there's no one on the planet who resembles this, but I think that there's the sense that there's a much, much bigger supply of this impossible opposite man than is actually the case. And so I think that it's really useful to kind of honor that congruence. And so you can pay attention to if someone is putting this lack of congruence, like you have to be this and this when they're opposite things onto you. You can pay attention to whether you're paying attention to really wanting things. You're like, I want him to be a warrior survivalist, but I also want him to, be able to sit next to me and appreciate the opera and then have a deep, meaningful conversation about whether we want to have children or not that is attuned and available. There just might not be that many humans that have, all of those qualities at once. So there can be a lot of frustration. I think for women, you could almost look at it as the chakras not really talking to each other in a coherent way about what would really work for you in relationship. And instead, cave woman is, screaming for the highest status, the most beauty, the most strength, the best DNA, the best hunter, which is totally valid. Cave woman is about survival, but then you wanting to have all this communicative, visioning together, co-creation energy. And those, again, just might not all show up in the same individual. And one of the ways we might not resolve that argument between the chakras when seeking a partner is if we just kind of keep going with this impossible person standard. So I think it's really useful to spot if it's being put on us, like, wow, your expectations for me are really unattainable. I'd really love it if you, either put your arms around like, yeah, this is for me, like, this is what's fantastic about Katie and this is what's annoying about Katie. And they're kind of the same thing, but I'm so much more in the enjoyment and celebration of these things that it's totally worth it to put up with the shadow side of some of these qualities. I'm a really kick-ass problem solver. I have information from my guides and your guides and a huge body of experience and a genuine desire for you to get the results you want in the world. And so I definitely can have empathy, but if all you want is lots and lots of empathy and lots of, you did everything right, but you're totally going to get different results, but, this is totally on the rest of the world. You have no part in what you've created. And, therefore, we won't even talk about the possibility that you could engage in a more elegant way and create something like, I'm not a good person, if you want that. And it can feel a little bit misaligned. And I've done a lot to, manage the blending of empathy and acknowledgement with the problem solving. But sometimes I think people just want to be told, like, you're absolutely right, and I totally agree with you, and everybody else is a jerk, and how awful that happened to you. And I just wouldn't be a good person for that. And that's a really good thing for someone to know. So they're not trying to bring their bucket to just get pure empathy. And again, if they're a friend, they could, set me up for success by saying, I don't want any problem solving. I just really like empathy and to be heard and for you to acknowledge my feelings. And I can have more success with that. But, after about 15 minutes of that conversation, it's probably going to be interested in talking about something else. Another way that impossible opposite shows up is somebody, wanting someone to like be really super take charge and really successful in their career, but also like super available to cuddle. And, there's this kind of interesting thing that people can really create. But the thing I'm most interested in, I'm just getting to it now, and most concerned about is when we internalize the impossible opposites that our culture flings at us. And I feel like, somewhere somebody has like a formulaic rom-com. Here's how you create the woman. She needs to be sometimes capable, but sometimes, really under-functioning. So there are times when she's really functional, but also moments when she, all the functionality falls apart. She has to be quirky, so she's relatable, but, amazingly, pretty and appealing and winsome. You want the audience to be rooting for her. So they create this really weird amalgamation of characteristics and kind of stuff them together. And it creates this, kind of incoherent experience in a lot of ways. And of course, some things that we could watch or read that have a romantic theme are more well-rounded than others, but there's a lot of societal pressure where they're trying to sell people, especially women. Women do a lot of shopping for certain things, the remedy to be all things to all people, and the remedy to take a shortcut because of the impossibility of this kind of expectation where you would be casual and easy breezy and spontaneous, but, look fantastic and have your hair falling in beautiful waves all the time and able to cook an amazing meal, but, also, having a career and you totally made it to the gym, but then had time for, a deep, meaningful connection with your partner. And one of the people I follow and appreciate is Alison Armstrong. And she says the myth that we can have it all is killing women. And what she means by that is this notion that, you should be able to have kids and a career and a book club and, et cetera and so forth. They're just, it's too much structure. And sure, there may be a place where, these things can get woven together, but there's a notion that rather than that being like, wow, that is high grade, skillful Tetris to fit all those things in your life. Wow, that's amazing. That's a really hard thing to do. It can almost come across like an expectation. And it's good to be really crystal clear about not having puzzle pieces in there that don't fit. So my kind of deeper underlying idea of why I would want to talk for this long about this kind of interesting rhetorical pattern is sometimes I have clients who aren't honoring their internal congruence and sort of expect that, they might be really sensitive and really good with rapport, but they should also be really good with confrontation and standing their ground. And I would argue that those things don't necessarily go together. And I think there are a lot of learnable skills. So kind of a like, wow, I really don't like confrontation, but sometimes that's necessary. And let me, onboard some basic competency with that. And then also a lot of strategies to have other tools where it doesn't have to go to butting heads with someone. Sometimes it will. It's really nice if I don't have more of that than I have to. And there's nothing wrong with that, but the awareness that it's going to be expensive if you're a really sensitive person to go to confrontation for most people who have that quality is just a really good insight for how you move through the world. So, you trust that if someone's moving through the world really entitled and kind of bullying, there will be someone who's thrilled to, go toe to toe with them. I had a friend who, she adored her father, but at the same time growing up, there was domestic violence and, he was, just a really angry man with a hair temper. And she describes some of the experiences that she had where, he met someone who was a mirror and, at one point, like an old lady with a cane beating on his car because he was trying to bully her to hurry up and get out of the way. And another experience on a train where it literally came to fisticuffs over whose seat it was. I really, that's one of the sort of consolations. I'm like, wow, someone else will provide a reflection to this, person about their way of being in the world. I can spare my nervous system and just, move around them or move away from them if at all possible. But similarly, if you are really good at depth and rapport and like meaningful conversations, you're probably not going to be the person holding court at a party, telling stories that make the whole room laugh, but also kind of dominating the conversation, and again, there's some outliers where people are like, yeah, I really authentically am both of those things. There could be the person who genuinely gets a kick out of sporting events and hot dogs and lukewarm beer, and they think it's a blast, and they also have a PhD and they're deeply immersed in academia. But there might not be the most overlap between people who have those individual aspects. And it's not making one right or wrong. It's totally, all these things are totally valid. It's just that if we expect of ourselves, if we find ourselves wanting or flawed because of the areas where what we're magnificent at means that we're just not going to be as strong at this other thing over here, we can certainly, be pragmatic about, like, okay, well, that's an important competency, so I should probably put some attention on getting good enough at it and just know that it's going to be challenging. So for me, for example, as a very energetically sensitive person, I've worked a lot to onboard energetic management strategies so that I can move through the world. I can go to the grocery store. I can get on an airplane and travel through all the soup of all these different energetic impressions. And I also know that it's not kind to me to schedule a super duper long travel day if I can help it. And probably after any travel day on day 2, I'm going to be tired. And when I'm moving through the airport, I'm very strategic about trying to find the place with the least wall of noise and chaos and people running around, whereas someone else might find airports really invigorating and love the people watching. There's a lot of life that's happening in a lot of different ways at airports, a lot of funny moments, sometimes watching, the parents wrangling their toddlers through, can be endearing and, the humanity kind of moments. But part of that energetic sensitivity that means it's going to be more expensive for me to go through an airport than for an average person is the work that I get to do, because most people can't read energy and talk to the guides and have experiences to the degree that I can. And I really love that, but I also don't have this story that I'm somehow defective or bad because big groups of people with a lot of noise and a lot of chaos and a lot of intensity aren't my cup of tea. And I can even be really spacey. And I've learned to kind of give myself grace of like, wow, I am not tracking as well as I could be without it being a point of how awful that I wasn't completely focused and on the ball and assimilating information at my top speed in a really chaotic environment. But a lot of times with our society and maybe feedback where somebody would like us to do something else and they made a case for it by telling us that the way we do things is bad and wrong, with the vested interest of us participating differently in a way that's advantageous to them and disadvantageous to us, we may have just really taken on this story that we should be capable of being all the things. We should be able to be really focused and productive, but also really spontaneous and carefree. We should be really, really playful, but also really aware of social cues and nuances. And, just this kind of notion that any quality that's appreciated or valued in women in some way, we might end up comparing ourselves. Oh, how much am I that way? How much am I this other way? And some of it, might be like, oh yeah, I feel really good about these qualities in this way that I am in the world. But there can also be this shame or sense of deficit in other things. And I'm talking again more about women, but this of course can apply to men too, or non-binary folks, with all the different maps that, there for men, there's a lot of gendered stuff about, you should be the warrior, you should stand your ground, and you should be tough, you shouldn't have emotions. I was listening to something related to neuroscience, and it actually said that men's emotions tend to be more intense, like there's more of the brain firing in a particular emotional state, but they're heavily, heavily conditioned to shut that down, to ignore, to suppress. And that this whole really crazy notion of the map of who we should be that can be absorbed through a lot of fiction, a lot of TV shows, a lot of manufactured scenarios, a lot of weird family culture, can really leave us with a weird and wacky view of who we should be, and a lot of shame about not being the impossible opposites person. And I just wanted to kind of illuminate that because, you might have more peace with the areas that you don't feel as strong in, is if you see the magnificence that you have that's kind of the other side of that coin in a particular area. And again, I'm a big fan of, things being learnable skills if it's absolutely necessary, but also kind of a deep acceptance of your nature and your interests and how you want to move. And the onboarding of skill isn't to say that you're ineffective or in deficit. It's just that competence at different things can really unlock ease and elegance in moving through the world. And so I hope that there's something here. This kind of has a bit of nuance to it. But whether you're, shaking off the messaging from someone else about asking you to be, all things, or, looking for that in someone, or expecting and requiring that of yourself, all of these things are really going to mess with your results and kind of leave you in a little bit of a spinny, treadmill-y, running in a circle kind of state. So I wanted to illuminate them in case it helps you to have a little bit more clarity about how you move with each of these kinds of things. Thank you so much for joining me. To learn more about me and my work, please visit my website at handsoverheart.com. There you can join my mailing list for access to free bonus content in the members-only area. If you've enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It would help me out a lot. If you'd like to receive personal shamanic support from me and my team of guides, please consider joining my Patreon community. You'll find the link below. And again, thank you so much for listening. This is Katie Weatherup, wishing you wholeness and happiness.